In part 2 of How to Think About Climate Change, I talk about what I call the spirit of a debate. Vigorous debate helps us to move forwards. Done right, it can be a powerful process to help you think about an issue. Let's discuss. My name is Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show for Changemakers. This is part 2 in a 5-part series on how to think about climate change. Part 1, scientific mindset. Part 2, this one, the spirit of a debate. 3, seeing the context clearly. 4, understanding our own limitations. And 5, finding our way to a solution. You may be wondering, why talk about how to debate in a series that's headed How to Think? Surely the two are separate. First you do the thinking, then you do the debating. People that are just supporting a side do it that way. For people who aim to think for themselves, debating ideas is how you test them, refine them, and ultimately rethink them. But not all styles of debate achieve this. If you're using debate to support your aim to get to the truth, then you're following certain objectives. These include seeking to persuade people to be interested to discover what's true and important, to expose your own ideas to attack and thereby help improve them, and to achieve mutual understanding, even if that doesn't create mutual agreement. The latter is often not possible, but the former always should be. Alternatively, you may be tempted towards debate objectives that doesn't help that process, of which you might find first, to crush the competition. People want to be 100% right and to prove unquestionably that their opponent is 100% wrong. Trying to do that can lead to absurd positions, shackled to a refusal on principle to back down. The need to be right crowds out the opportunity to listen to alternative arguments, except as the cues for the deployment of your own next killer argument. And then there's also to feed yourself a dopamine hit. If you get a little thrill from sticking it to the libtards or defeating the deniers, as encouraged by all the combative YouTube videos on crushing the competition, it becomes an addiction, not necessarily a healthy one. And 3, in response to fear and anger, I get a few really angry people commenting on my channel. Angry because they really do believe their children are going to die from climate change, or angry because they really do believe that all people who support the science of climate change are communists hell-bent on bringing down their freedoms. Those fears are fed by a media whose business model is to get you reading or watching more of their content. They do that by playing to those fears, pulling out every item that could feed them and push them to a higher intensity, because if you're scared and angry at the world, you'll want more information, more commentary, more things to feed your view of this awful problem that faces us. The left does it, the right does it, it's not personal, it's just the business of clicks. And we're all susceptible to it. But letting that mindset that they create in you in order to sell their product, to let that control how you approach discussions with people, with other human beings, is a really bad idea. Because those people almost certainly don't match the caricature that you've been misled to believe in. Okay, so suppose we accept the premise that good debate can support thinking about a subject. Obviously, it's not restricted only to climate change. What are the rules to make it a good debate? Here's some of my thoughts, you may have others. 1. Identify what actually divides you. Is it a disagreement on facts? Is it a differing worldview? Is it a different professional perspective? Very often the thing that becomes the initial focus for an argument isn't the real issue at all. When you spend time finding the point of disagreement, we may find that we have points of agreement that we didn't really predict. And the point of disagreement can come from all sorts of places. It's a differing worldview at least as often as it is down to facts and reason. It may come down to political left and right. It may come down to rural or metropolitan. It may come down to artist or engineer. To find it, you have to put to one side your preconceptions and listen actively for what you think is underpinning your opponent's argument. Then try steel manning their position, as opposed to straw manning it. We all know about straw manning. It's a debate tactic to misrepresent an opponent's argument in a way that makes it easy to defeat. Anyone can do that to any argument, and it's not very effective most of the time. Steel manning means that you take the essence of an argument so you can repeat it back to them in your own words and they agree with you that you got it right. It's a powerful way to help someone clarify their position, and it sometimes leads opponents even to recognise contradictions in their own position. Sometimes. 2. Focus on the issues, not on the opponent. We've all become aware in recent years of things like cognitive dissonance, the thrashing around that can be the sign that a fact just flatly contradicted your existing set of beliefs, and confirmation bias, pulling out the facts that reinforce your existing view and missing the rest. What you tend to see in a lot of the debates now is a bunch of people accusing each other of bias or cognitive dissonance. But here's the thing. The lesson we get from psychology isn't that it helps us to spot when other people are wrong. We're all geniuses at doing that already. The point of it is that 90% of the effort needs to go into spotting those things in yourself. So spend time on reviewing your own cognitive biases and focus on people's arguments rather than telling them how biased you think they are. If they're biased, then that means they should have put forward an argument that's factually incorrect. So focus on the argument, not your amateur psychology. In the same vein, don't dismiss your opponents with labels that they wouldn't give themselves, unless they're purely descriptive and have no derogatory connotations. Labelling people is not the same as an argument. And apparently it needs to be pointed out, you don't also persuade anyone by calling them an idiot. I know, weird, but true. 3. Avoid the view that the positions of some people are beneath you to debate. It's arrogant and it's not even good strategy. Bad arguments, if such they are, fail in the face of good arguments. But don't assume you're so brilliant that you can always tell the difference. You may find that there are better challenges to your position from these people than you realised. Even if it's just on the principle that a broken clock is right twice a day, you should judge the arguments regardless of where they come from. I see people on one side suggesting someone's arguments can be dismissed because they have some financial connection to, say, the oil industry or whatever vested interest on whichever side it may be. Generally, neutral people care about that a lot less than you do. If you walk away from a debate because you decide that the other person is compromised by conflicts of interest, or you've decided the debate is over and it's been won, well, you simply leave a space for them to fill. I look at it differently. Organisations with a vested interest in an argument will usually work harder than anyone else to locate and mobilise the most powerful arguments for their position. Rather than being the people you should refuse to debate, they are the ones whose arguments are the most worthy of being engaged. Once again, they may even be right, even though they're being paid. Just because they represent an interest doesn't make it an invalid interest. Such a debate may identify as well a third path that provides a win for both sides. And if they don't have good arguments, but they just try to spread falsified information, smears and innuendo, then all the easier to expose those with good arguments. 4. Avoid the common attempts to distract you from the main point. For example, allegations that other people on your side have been wrong about something, trying to get you to defend what they said rather than to discuss the actual issue. It's very easy for a discussion on a point of science or political principle to get distracted by a he said, she said type discussion. The number of commenters on these videos who pitch in on the subject of what Al Gore did or didn't say, as though I would care. Unless I said it, or unless I said that Al Gore speaks for me, which he doesn't, then what an American politician said in a movie 15 years ago is arguably not that relevant. Unless we're talking about how well or badly represented some of the science has been, in which case we may well end up agreeing. Equally, if I didn't say that people on the coast would be underwater within the next decade or two, and very few people I have ever seen said that, then likewise, none of us cares where Obama or Gore buy their houses. 5. Argue effectively. For some reason, people get heavily into forms of argument that are unpersuasive, uninteresting, and rather intellectually sterile. If you want to engage an argument, then make a point. Make a proposition. Support that proposition with some evidence. What people in YouTube comment sections often do is they present a list of gotcha questions. They give you hoops to jump through to prove something that they think is unprovable. And of course, generally that would be a fool's errand for you to respond to those, because by asking a question rather than making a proposition, they aim to put you in a position of trying to prove something when they haven't even revealed what their own point is. In those situations, I will do one of several things, depending on the nature of the question or the proposition. I will either suggest that rather than me responding to opaque questions, perhaps instead they'd just like to make their point so that we can cut to the substance. That's generally for lists where the intent is rather cloaked. You know there's a gotcha lying in wait, but it's not obvious where it is. Alternatively, if it's just a long list of challenges to a position, you can ask them which of their list of questions or statements do they think is the most important, which is the hardest question to answer or the hardest point to debunk. If they tell you, you can then answer that one and ask that since you've answered what they thought was their hardest question, maybe they should reconsider how strong the others are. In my experience, they often don't respond to the invitation because ultimately they're following a script that depends upon a compliant response. If you don't give that, there's kind of nowhere for the script to go. You have to have an actual conversation, which if they're interested in using debate as a form of thinking, they'll be into. There are certainly some excellent people on both sides in that vein who come into the comment sections of these videos. But they're rather outnumbered by the people who are simply there to win, and to do so by trying to trick you into an answer they can attack or exposing what you think they know about what you believe because they think large groups of people surely all think the same. And finally, understand the standard logical fallacies and try to avoid them. I'm not going to go through them all here, Google it. I will just point to one of the most common, which is that quite a few people seem to get very mixed up with what is or is not an argument from authority. An argument from authority is if I support my argument by pointing out that a named expert also supports it and therefore it must be right. I get this used against me all the time from both sides. Oh, so you think you know more than Professor Richard Lindzen, do you? Oh, so you think you know more than Professor Kevin Anderson, do you? And my pointing out that I get this from both sides rather illustrates the point. Almost any position can find an expert whose personal opinion will support. Human beings generally don't form their opinions through a rational process, and that applies to scientists as well, particularly if you're dealing with an area that's outside their central professional competence. This is why I look to the peer-reviewed research for evidence. It's not always perfect, but it's based on more than just opinion. It's laid out, can therefore be scrutinised and criticised. When I quote a paper, I'll say, here's some research that suggests X. If you know of any research in a respectable journal that contradicts it, that would be useful to see. Then we could follow that up by seeing what debate there had been between the experts on those points of difference with those two papers. So for instance, on my video on species extinction, I noted that a newly released piece of research, which was provoking lots of news stories about Insectageddon, was being criticised for its methodology by mainstream credible entomologists. I looked at their arguments and checked them against what the authors of the papers had described of their own methodology, and they seemed pretty solid critiques. And so I reflected that in the narrative for that video, giving references to both the paper and the critiques. That shows that you don't have to take published peer-reviewed papers as gospel, but quoting them is very different to an argument from authority. An argument from authority invites you to suspend critical judgment and simply trust the judgment of another person on the grounds of their expertise. There are times when you definitely want to do that. When you're going to a doctor to support you through a life-threatening disease, for instance, you might want to do that. But for matters of public policy, we generally expect higher levels of evidence and scrutiny. Why doesn't everyone follow these good rules for debate? Well, a lot of the time they just haven't really thought about it and they copy the arguing conventions that they see others on their side practicing. But most often, of course, it's because their objective in debating isn't to help them think about an issue, but to achieve a goal that will be supported by persuading people. If you're an organisation whose interests are threatened by a proposal, you may commission people, actually, yes, to spread misinformation, knowing it will help to achieve your end goal. And probably those people have a self-justification that works for them. We're all the heroes of our own movies, after all. Something like the end justifies the means or something like that. The trick is not to get distracted when you're facing an opponent like that. Good debate remains powerful even when faced with bad intentions on the other side. Do you agree? Do you disagree? It'll be fascinating to see if the nature of the debate in the comment section for this video reflects or ignores the content of the video itself.